Oh my... You guys are going to hate me for this one, I know it. Can a fandom actually ruin the thing that you love? So, I've had a little bit of problems with the Undertale fandom and how insistent that fandom is that a game that's all about personal choice is played a certain way. They're also really, really bad about spoilers. Like, really, really bad about spoilers. Like, guys, if you are telling someone, oh, you can't wait to find out what happens with this character later, you've technically spoiled something. Because now the person knows, oh, well, this is probably going to be more important. And so any little surprise of, oh, that's what that meant, is completely and totally lost. But I never really thought that the Homestuck fandom was really anywhere near as toxic or obnoxious as a lot of people claimed it was. I often thought a lot of the claims about the fandom were overblown. Yes, I know that there were a lot of little incidents and even a couple of big incidents that really made the fandom kind of look a little crazy in the eyes of some of the other fandoms. But every time I hear complaints about the Homestuck fandom, it brings me back to the old days of the original Trek fans. Now, I was never in the original Trek fandom. Star Trek, the original series, was before my time, so it was never part of that first original craze. But I was aware of some of the stigma that Trek fans had, especially as I became a next-gen Trek fan. You know, things like, just tell me if any of this sounds familiar. Running around conventions in groups together, being obnoxious. Costuming with simple, childish costumes that require no skill or effort. Not properly sealing body paint and getting it smudged everywhere. Running up and glomping or tackling their favorite characters. Being especially exuberant and obnoxious to personalities that they like. If any of that sounds familiar, Homestuck fandom, yeah, no, this is nothing you actually have any claim to. In all honesty, the Homestuck fandom is a great fandom. It has been a wonderful place, and it is, in many ways, one of the few reasons I'm still on this planet. That being said, so, guys, as important as the fandom is to Homestuck, there is a distinct difference between the fandom and Homestuck. They are not, in actuality, the same entity. Even with how much Andrew Hussey drew from the fandom for personal inspiration, and even with all of the artists and talent he recruited out of the fandom, Homestuck has always been a specific story that Hussey has always had certain goals for. He has stated this many, many times. In reality, he's brought everything to fruition pretty much the way he said he was going to. And when you go back and you do your reread, some of the complaints people have about things that happen in Act 6 and things that happened in the ending, they actually don't have any part of the story themselves. The story not only hints that these things are going to occur, but in many cases it directly comes out and tells you that this is what's going to happen. Like, so why were we surprised? If Hussey said he was going to do these things, and the story said it was going to do these things. Where did we go wrong? Could we have gone wrong? That doesn't make a lot of sense, doesn't it? You know, if you spent all your time pouring your heart and soul into this comic and searching and reading for all of these details about all of these characters and all of the stuff that's going on in the plot, is it possible to dig in too much? Is it possible to create something completely new? Well, we actually have a term for that, and it's a term that has existed for a decent period of time now. It's called Fanon. Also known occasionally as headcanons. Fanon is when a large percentage of the fandom adopts an idea from a story to be canon that the story doesn't necessarily actually represent that way. Now, one of the things that might occur here, and one of the arguments you might make about this was I go into this, and I want to address this really quick. It's the concept of death of the author. I've brought up the concept of death of the author in some of these discussions before. But here's the thing. That's not exactly what happened with Homestuck. See, death of the author is the idea that when you read a story or any piece of media that's created by an individual or a team of individuals, eventually that individual's goals, no matter how stated, no matter what they are eventually have to just be discarded to the side. And the story itself has to speak for itself at that point. This is usually because, you know, back in the old day, well, eventually the author was going to die, so you couldn't go and ask the author, what did they mean by this? Hence the phrase, death of the author. So you literally have to look at like a novel or a movie or short story or a comic book or even a video game, and you literally just have to let that media stand by itself and let it talk for itself. So whatever Hussey's intentions might have been, eventually they're not going to be important. But this is a unique case because we didn't have the whole story standing and speaking for itself. We had Hussey giving us updates in this story, you know, piece by piece as we went along. And it isn't until the end of the comic that we actually had the whole story to speak for itself. And up until that point, we were speaking for the comic in lieu of anything from Hussey himself. So with that in mind, it's almost like you now have to use a new term, death of a fandom. The comic is now complete. We now have the story. With the exception of the epilogue, we've got everything from beginning to end that now has to stand on its own and has to be interpreted on its own. And actually, when you look at a lot of the critics who have gone back, who basically ignored Homestuck until it was done, and decided, okay, Homestuck's over, that's officially ended. Let's actually see if Homestuck actually was worth anything in the long run. Most of them are coming back, and they're going, yeah, Homestuck's fantastic. They're not complaining about the ending. They're not complaining about any of it. If they're complaining about anything, they usually have the same complaint that a lot of the fandom has. Act 1 is slow and a little tedious to get through. But even then, like, as a whole, most critics are appreciating the work for what it is. Speaking for itself, everything seems to be working. So why is the fandom unhappy? Well, it gets back to that concept of Fanon. We started creating our own stories. And Hussey empowered us to do that more than any author ever has. Between the alternate universe structure, the tweets he made basically giving us carte blanche to do whatever shipping dreams we wanted, or whatever alternate universes we wanted. And, all ships are canon, all AUs are canon kind of statements that he'd like to make for fun. And, of course, there's the fact that if you were a skilled enough writer, a skilled enough artist, a skilled enough animator or musician, you could end up working on Homestuck. And a lot of people did. So the fandom was empowered and inflamed to do things that, in my opinion, no other fandom has gone to these lengths before. Not the Star Wars fandom, not the Star Trek fandom. There is a reason why some people really did think that the Homestucks were crazy, even though, like I said, most people think that most fandoms are crazy. We got a golden ticket to this universe for all practical intensive purposes, and we used it. The problem is, for some people, that golden ticket actually began to replace the universe we were originally playing around in. I'll give you a personal example. Okay? So, Collide happens. And Collide is supposed to be our big climactic battle. That is our climax. That is the climax of Homestuck. That is what Hussey stated was going to be the climax. That was his intention from the start. So Collide happens. My favorite villain, the Condus, is killed by being stabbed in the back. But the Condus had the whole immortality curse thing going. Now that was a really, really cool idea. And it was something that they talked a decent amount about in the comic. It wasn't like a huge topic of conversation, but it was something that was brought up and detailed out. That the terms of service for Lord English always come with the same price, penalty, and reward. And that penalty and reward are the same. The death of at the hands of your successor. So that sounded like such a great idea to play with, didn't it? I mean, think about that. One of the kids or trolls could have ended up becoming a villain in the story, a new villain to play with, because of the consequences of that immortality curse. That's such a cool, nifty idea. That's just great. Like, people talk about, like, BKE's inversion theory. And that was such a fantastic idea for taking beloved characters and making them potential villains and anti-heroes. But now you got this new one you can play with. And is there a way to avoid it? How do you circumvent it? What happens when someone gets... My mind was going crazy. Like, there was so much about that immortality curse that I was just fascinated by, and I couldn't wait to see how it was panned out. But at the end of the day, the Condus still needs to die. The kids still need to win. And she makes a really, really good last bad guy for the kids to fight in claiming their prize, considering the whole setup that existed for Lord English being taken down by Mina, Vriska, and Calliope. So if she's going to be the final bad, the final obstacle for the kids, she does have to be taken down. And if beating the immortality curse is as simple as using a rumored cue ball weapon, a known legendary artifact that has been demonstrated doing amazing things that only the most powerful of legendary swords should ever have been capable of doing. If that sword is strong enough to overcome the immortality curse according to the story, well, that wraps that up. the potential is lost. All the cool things that I'd come up with, all of the ideas that went in my head, they're gone. They don't get to be played around with. And that kind of sucks. Like, it really kind of sucks. But at the end of the day, Homestuck's not about the immortality curse. The immortality curse is just another plot device. It's another part of the story. It's another aspect of Lord English as the villain and the Condescender power set. That's the purpose that the immortality curse serves. It was never meant there to be a huge plot angle that was going to be twisted around. Again, we were in Act 6. Hussey had said Act 6 was going to be the end of Homestuck. Act 7 would be a very short act that just wrapped everything up. He told us that that was what was going to happen. So when Act 6's ending was Collide and the immortality curse hasn't come into play already, why would I have been expecting that it should? I mean, when I go back and think about it, I fooled myself into thinking that this was a cooler device, a cooler aspect of the story than it rather was. And Homestuck is filled with those things. It's filled with all of these fun, minute details that together make a great universe to explore, and a universe that I hope the fandom will continue to explore for years to come, and that new artists and authors will continue to explore and grow in. Hussey, I'm hoping, will actually go on to do the next project that he kept talking about, because I do want to see if he can take the lessons he's learned from all of his storytelling experiments in Homestuck to tell an even bigger, better story. But, you know, at the end of the day, as cool as the Homestuck universe is, and as many little fun details exist, the story is not the whole story of the whole universe. The story is confined to a set narrative. It's like the difference between The Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth. The Lord of the Rings is its own narrative, and a lot of the things that happen in Middle-earth are very important to the development of the story in The Lord of the Rings. But not everything in Middle-earth is important to the story of The Lord of the Rings. And eventually, you know, Tolkien had hoped to go and expand on those stories elsewhere, and that's part of where the Silmarillion came from. Although the Silmarillion was something he was working on even before The Lord of the Rings. So we need to separate that concept between universe, the actual story itself that Hussey has presented to us, and our Fanon. Because our Fanon is neither Homestuck or the Homestuck universe. It is something that we have created as we have explored and understood. And remember, we've spent a lot of time exploring this universe. Even more time than the comic has actually technically existed for. Because yes, the comic existed for 7 years, but it wasn't running and updating for all of that 7 years. Whereas we were doing our thing for all of that 7 years. So there's actually a lot more Fanon out there than there is canon. And the two are not the same thing. And now a lot of people are going to obviously say, no, I'm not doing that. Like I said, this is going to be probably the most controversial of my ideas as to where a bias against the ending to Homestuck can come from. But I honestly, like, if you're one of those people who thought that it was really important that the kids fought Lord English, that's something I think we all wanted to see. The comic directly says they're not. Like, Calliope specifically tells them, no, that's not your job. If you look at the setup, the battle with Lord English was always going to end with Vriska. Like, she is literally set up from the beginning of her introduction, from when we start learning who Vriska is and what her goals are. From the very beginning, she's stating she's the one who's going to bring down the big bad. She thought the big bad was going to be Jack. But when she found out there was a bigger bad, oh, her goals changed right away, didn't they? And people might say, well, Vriska's not the main character. Yeah, she's also the Thief of Light. I mean, you know how Hussey likes his puns, like John and the Air of Breath and Breath of Air? She literally stole the spotlight for killing Lord English. It was literally written into her character's title. So the comic actually directly comes out and says that that fight wasn't going to happen. We wanted it to happen. Oh man, did we want it to happen. I was waiting for that problem sleuth style fight where all of these crazy disparate forces all came together against this one final boss. I was actually not expecting Casey and the Skeleton Army to show up until the fight with Lord English. That was my honest prediction. I knew that Casey slash Bubbles von Salamancer was coming back with those skeletons. I thought it was going to be the fight against Lord English. Instead, it was the fight against the Felt, which I guess is actually a more appropriate use of that very resource. It's like, yes, we're going to use the Salamander and the tiny army of skeletons against the boss that can destroy entire planets. That's going to work. But that's just one example. So I've given you a personal example, and I've given you an example directly from the comic that so much of the fandom was convinced was going to happen. When the comic itself, when the characters was in the comic, not only were clearly on certain paths, but they directly told you, reliable authority, Alt Calliope. We know regular Calliope is an unreliable narrator. We know that she does not know all of the story, and she does not know what her purpose or anything is. But right from the get-go, we are shown Alt Calliope as an authority figure, as someone who knows what her place is, what her purpose is, and also what everyone else's place and purpose is. And she tells us, Lord English is not their responsibility, directly. And from the get-go, what was the goal? Literally, from the beginning of Homestuck, what was the true objective? What was the true adversary the kids were playing against? It was Spurb. Spurb has always been the objective. Spurb has always been the actual adversary of Homestuck. Not Lord English, not the Condess, not Jack Noir. It's always been Spurb. It has always been this game that has ripped these kids out of their innocence and forced them into this horrible, just soul-crushing situation that nearly breaks them. I think, honestly, one of the reasons why we're shown the pre-retcon universe before John saves it is because I think Hussey needed to get across to us the fact that the damage that this series of events has done to these kids, they almost don't survive it. And I think that's one of the most important things to remember when looking at the ending. People often say, well, we spend so much time with the Genesis Frog. Why do we focus on the stupid Genesis Frog for so long? Because that was the end game. That was the final goal. From the comic's first inception, from the initial description in Act 2, where Nana hints at the great things that John is going to do, the Genesis Frog has always been the final goal. That has always been what was important in the long run. It's just that, again, the fandom decided that Lord English was what was important. The Condess was what was important. Jack Noir was what was important. But it's always been that frog. So, again, a lot of this is very, very much personal hypothesis. If you prefer the colloquial theory, then we can say theory. And again, I'm not expecting a lot of you to like this one. I'm expecting at least a little bit of hate. Just a little hate for saying that maybe if you don't like the ending, it's your fault for being a fan. Don't hurt me.